Hello. How are you? Welcome to my show. My name is Bret. It's St. Patrick's Day, and let's get into it. I have a few announcements, maybe some things to cover, but if this is your first time on the show, then welcome. This is something I do every month. This is a special show focused mostly around my courses, but anything goes. We're talking about DevOps, containers, Docker, Kubernetes, all the things related to the CNCF ecosystem, and my courses, which don't cover all of that. They cover a very small fraction of that. So I invite my course participants every month, and we try to do this every month, and basically help you with your current issues. Maybe they're real production issues. Maybe they're issues in the course. Maybe you found one of my outdated videos that has a difficult time getting through. And that's why you're here. Or maybe you just randomly showed up from YouTube, and that's great too. Glad to have you. So this is a live show I do every Thursday. You can support the show over on Patreon. And I'm looking into YouTube join button. Maybe some people would prefer that over Patreon. I don't really have a strong opinion there. So if anyone has thoughts on that, throw them in chat or thumbs up if you want more ways to buy me a coffee. Essentially, that's what this is. This is a thank you to me, and it's also a way for me to email you. So this is the number one way you can get weekly updates on the open source I'm creating, any major course releases or updates, guests I'm going to have on this show, new podcasts released every week, all that stuff. You just have to click the follow button, totally free. You don't have to buy me anything. But if you want extra benefits or you just want to thank me with a coffee, you can do that too. Or, of course, this is YouTube, so you can do a super sticker right now, or like and subscribe and do all those things. Anyway, I appreciate all the love. Anything you can give, I totally appreciate it. Yesterday, we had our High Fivers Club. That's this little $5 a month deal on the right. That is basically in our Discord hangout, which you can get to free right here, devops.fan. Every month, we do a video hangout. It's kind of like a water cooler chat for DevOps professionals. And we do that once a month. And we did that yesterday. We talked about some things. I'll cover a few of those here, and we will have one next month. So if you're interested in joining, sign up for that here. You can also do that by being a Discord server booster. So if you're a Nitro user on Discord, if this doesn't make any sense to you, you can ignore it. But if you're on Discord, which is honestly my favorite chat system nowadays, at least for communities, it's a great place for communities. And we have now almost 10,000 people in our DevOps community. So thank you to all of you that are in there for that. I really appreciate it. And I want to make that community better. So we had an idea yesterday that we maybe do some live events in that Discord server. If any of you are interested in giving a short talk, a presentation, maybe you're not someone who's used to big conferences or submitting to that. If you would like to do that to the Discord community, I am happy to support that and to tell everybody on that Discord server with all those people that, hey, we're going to have a DevOps talk on this day and so is going to give it. I'm happy to have people on. That would be great. There's already voice and video channels in there, and we can, in fact, I'm going to pull that up. If I go to devops.fan, hopefully I'm still signed in. Yeah, so, not signed in. I'll get in there. I am a human. Please log me in. Okay. So over on this server, right, we've got some channels. Not everybody sees all the channels. I am admin, but so you got your course channels down there at the bottom, but we have voice channels, which are voice video screen sharing channels. And I even have ones where if you just want to meet with someone else just one-on-one, that's what the duo channel is for. So that way you don't get other people joining. Maybe you want to have a private conversation. Or, like trio and quad members, and then there's the general, which means anybody can join, and as many people as can fit. I think it's like, I don't know what it is, 100, 1,000. I'm not sure what the limit there is. But if we were interested in doing something where people want to line up and talk about some things or show off something, and you would like people to actually be there, in other words, someone announced to the entire channel, entire server, then let's do it. Contact me on there, send me a DM, have a conversation in the chat. Like, this would actually be an interesting conversation in general for us to just say, is anyone interested in talking? Let's pick a day, and if people can commit, totally willing to support that. I'll announce it to the internet, make it a megaphone, and bring people in. The one thing I can't do is do my own talks because I'm prepping for DockerCon's community event, which is coming up here in a few weeks. If you're interested in that, just go to docker.com. We're going to have our 9th birthday for Docker, and I'm going to be speaking at that, hopefully. And then hopefully my talk is accepted to DockerCon in May. Also, just go to dockercon.com for that. I will hopefully be talking there. And so I'm too busy with all those talks to do another one. But if any of you would like to talk on something DevOps related, let me know. Let's figure it out. That was a great idea yesterday, by the way. Oh, hello, Anais. Nuno's here. Well, it's great. Everybody's stopping by. I love it. Got Ryan. Hello. Raphael. Some of the regulars. Kamajiru. Anton. Thank you all for being here. So let me get through the announcements real quick. The last thing I have, we've got some future guests. By the way, next week I've got David Flanagan. You know him on the internet as Raw Code. He has a great channel and has had probably some of you even on his channel. He does some really cool stuff. And he's gonna be on the show next week. We're gonna talk about Pulumi, and we're gonna show off some GitOps stuff for code as infrastructure as code in true code form. So that'll be fun. Raw Code is awesome. And then we've got HashiCorp coming in, Eric from HashiCorp in April, and we're going to talk about some of that stuff. That they do lots of cool things, right? You've probably used their stuff every day. And then we got Shippa coming on later that month. Anyway, we got a bunch of people coming in the next couple of months. Exciting stuff. So come back every Thursday, or listen to the podcast, which comes out on Fridays usually. And the Friday podcast is an edited down version of those conversations. You don't get the demo, you don't get all that cool stuff, but you do get the conversation. We kind of shorten it down for just the essentials there. The one announcement, the only thing I really have that's like current events, was something that happened yesterday, again from David Raw Code on the internet, that I learned from. I'm a huge fan of 1Password. And I used to be a LastPass person. And yes, I know about Dashlane and like all the other things out there, and they're all great. But I was originally a LastPass person when it was very young. And at some point, they kind of stopped innovating, in my opinion. And 1Password has continued to innovate. And now, and I fully back them, recommend them for all my clients. In fact, a lot of my big clients use them, small clients too. It's sort of becoming the DevOps password manager du jour for humans, but it's largely just been for humans. And over the last few years, the robot accounts have started to come in. So the nice thing is that there's a whole developer community now in 1Password. They're making tools for developers. They even have a Kubernetes operator that you can plug in, basically a controller, and you can start plugging in 1Password to HashiCorp projects. I think Terraform, they have a provider there. They're adding more and more stuff. They got a great CLI. And this newest release, now you have to kind of be in the beta of the Mac or Windows version 8, and I am in because version 8 of their tool is fantastic. I think it's a welcome upgrade and feature, or at least a UI experience to the version 7. And version 8 I use every day. I mean, I have thousands of passwords in there, right? My family, my whole family uses it. So inside here, anyway, they now have an ability to manage your SSH keys, which I have played around with other tools for this, and it always requires like epic nerd level thinking, right? It's you really have to get into SSH and all the tooling, and it's very device specific. So you got to set it up on this device, and then it's a whole process to set up on that one. And they've never been as great as this or as seamless as this. So go check out. I don't think anyone has a video yet. I haven't looked on YouTube. Someone should just make a video on this. But essentially, all you do, if you already have 1Password, is if you're on beta 8, and you're on the latest version of that, and it's been very stable. I've been using it for 6 months, and I haven't had an issue with the beta. You basically can drag your existing SSH keys in, even if they're encrypted, and you can also have it generate SSH keys, which is nice. We obviously can all do that from the command line, but now it's got a sort of a clicky approach to generating SSH keys, new ones, and then you can import your own. But once they're in there, you basically make a one-line change to your SSH config, and it runs in the background and basically replaces SSH agent. And when you SSH into something, it will prompt you on screen to use the key that it's authorizing, basically the server is allowing to be used. And you get sort of an approval for that key for that host, a one-by-one approval, and you have to go through the one password approval process. So, if you're on Mac, you can use your watch, you can use your thumbprint, you can use the Touch ID and all that to authorize, or you can type in your master password or whatever. Basically, whatever you've set up in 1Password as your authorization for passwords now happens with your SSH keys, which is awesome for several reasons. One, I can do this on all my devices, and if I have a laptop and a desktop, I can do them in both places, and I don't have to really do much work to set all this up. I also don't have to keep my keys in sync if I have multiple devices, because this does it for me now. I don't have to worry about encrypting them and typing in the password on every boot for SSH. If you've ever done this, I do this for all my keys. I encrypt them. So every time I log back into my computer and I bring up a shell, it says, hey, I'm starting SSH agent. Please type in the key for each key. Type in the password for each key, which is tedious, right? Especially if you're on Linux. There are some ways in Mac that you can actually have it stored in the Mac's key storage. But anyway, this is a really great central way. I've already converted all my stuff thanks to raw code and moved all my keys into there. And now whenever I use SSH, essentially when I request an SSH key, and this is the other thing, they're not stored on disk. They're only stored in 1Password. So they're only passed to the server at the time that it's needed, and then they're gone, basically, right? They are in memory inside of 1Password when it's running, but they're not at risk on that hard drive, even though mine are encrypted, right? Like you could brute force that password probably. So anyway, I love it. It's so much easier workflow, and they also have a great podcast. So I should probably have 1Password on the show at some point because I'm kind of a fan. But they have a great engineering podcast. If you just look up, I think 1Password podcast. Well, that's not really the podcast. That's the podcast episodes. Random but memorable. And it's kind of fun. I learned stuff. I was drawn to it when they announced their Linux GUI for 1Password. So now Linux desktop users get full 1Password support. And I really enjoyed it. So I've been sort of hitting that off and on. And it's a good one. It's a good team of people on that podcast. Interesting. All right. So check that out. Random memorable. Do we have any questions? Hard, easy, whatever you need. Trying to think what else that happened this week for me. I don't know what I do. I don't know what I do all week. I'm working on a new design for some course materials. So I've got a whole new tool that some of you have probably seen. That's actually the name of it. And it's a fun way to make your meetings more interesting. And I'm testing that in my workflow. So sometimes I get questions from people about, what tools do I use for making videos? But is basically a virtual camera that gives you lots of fun little quick ways to make your video more interesting. Obviously, replacing background, stuff like that. But and right now, there's a lot of features you can get for free. I think it's like a limited time per day kind of thing. But one of the things it's doing for us instructors or us teachers, people that are educating, is that it allows you now to basically you can record each slide separately, almost like a separate video, and then mix and match when you output. So it's a really interesting workflow. It's totally different than the typical workflow. And anyway, I'm experimenting with that. I'm also experimenting with, you've seen this before on the show, by the way, Excalidraw, a free open source, that is not the name. Oh, it's excalidraw.com, not .io. So it's there's lots of web-based editors, but the nice thing about this one is that it looks hand-drawn by default. You don't have to do it that way, but you can. Let's see, you can do some of this stuff. And one of the coolest things about this tool is that when you're done making your little sketchy, it's almost like a draft, right? Like a draft sketchy kind of product. There's a bunch of those out there that are especially used for UI mockups and stuff. But everybody's bringing in their own open source libraries. So we're basically getting a bunch of like the icons and stuff that we're used to. But one of the coolest things this thing does now is when you can export as a PNG or an SVG, but a lot of things don't support SVG, which is too bad. So then we do PNG, which is typically a binary, right? Like it's not the source material. It's always the export. It's always the format you're making for the web. But when you do this and you now embed scene, what that actually does is that stores the source metadata, which is just JSON, I believe. It stores that in the metadata of the PNG, which means you can re-edit your PNG. Your PNG has now become the source image, and you just re-upload them back up to re-edit them, which is kind of awesome. Like my entire life with tech, 30 plus years or whatever, I have always had the file that you load into the image editor, and then the export. I don't know why I keep saying output. The export that you create for the internet, or for whatever you're using it in, in a Keynote or whatever, Word document. And now this suddenly does this thing that is almost like magic. It's like now I don't have two files. I just have the one. And anyway, so what I'm planning to do with this is actually check it into Git code, right? To put it in GitHub. And then if I need to edit the PNGs later, I just open up that PNG and edit it. I've always had that challenge of how do you put images in places and then change them later when things change or you need to improve them. And I kind of have this tool now, and it's free. Another tool I'm using is Descript, which some of you maybe have seen. Descript has started as a podcast editor, but now a full-fledged video editor. And it's got some rough edges. It's got some hard limits. But Descript allows me to edit by editing a doc, like a Google Doc, right? So just like it's showing on the screen, I can basically edit text, and it's editing my video in the background as I'm deleting words from my captioning. That's what we've been using for the podcast and for our videos for a while now, and it's going to start making its way into new courses. So anyway, Valom, hello, and welcome to the DevOps community. Glad you're here. Anais, which one? Tried it in presentations. I have not tried. I think you're talking about right? So I have not tried in presentation. So I just started recording videos with it. I've used it in meetings, but I've only started playing with it the last few months and actually making videos with it. And there are a lot of constraints, and it has a very specific workflow, and I don't know if it's going to work out. But I think for me, and I'm different, everyone's different. For me, it's more important that I make more content rather than fancier content. I think I really learned hard the first 4 or 5 years I was doing this, that I was making very fancy course videos, and at least fancy to me, and putting a lot of effort into the production and the editing. And I want to increase the pace at which I make videos, which means I have to lower the bar of all that extra effort. And I think that possibly for me, will allow me to just rapid fire a little bit better. And so far, it's a learning process. I'm in the middle of it right now, actually. So when I put some YouTube videos out that are actually made with I will tell you. And you can let me know what you think. Anyway, it's very early days for this tool. Like, I hope they're successful. It's a very interesting way to make videos and mix and match different slides, because basically it makes an edit for each slide. That's kind of how it works. So as soon as you change slides, it starts almost like a new video. And then later you can actually choose, if you made 4 takes of that one slide, you can choose which take you want it to export into your video. And that's pretty interesting. It's a different workflow than I've ever used, right? We're all used to just clapping and making long tracks that we edit forever. And my goal is to shorten the editing time and the production time and just make it a little bit easier up front. Also, teleprompting, not something I've ever done before. I am totally ad lib all the time, and this will be my first year for trying teleprompters, which I am not liking so far. I don't like reading a script. Yes, I will let you know for sure. Ooh, any best tool for digital pen for writing? That's a random one. I don't consider myself an expert. Everything I have is now Apple Pencil. Before Apple Pencil, I had tried all sorts of little pencils with like old iPads and whatnot, but I'm an Apple person now, so Apple Pencil's the jam, and that's what I use to draw. Much to my own demise, because I do have some really crappy videos where I draw and it looks like chicken scratches. And I'm trying to up my game a little bit with Excel-Draw, which it sounds like Anais approves of. Thoughts on, Raphael, another question, thoughts on OCI. I'm new here, so I'm sorry if the frequent question you. Well, thoughts on OCI. It is great. I mean, it's a standard. It's a set of standards, right? And they're necessary for the industry to agree upon these standards, like Docker files, Docker images, registries, image transfer formats, and all those things. And those are all set up, right? So we kind of have that. I don't know where it goes from here. I don't know if we're going to see really any Kubernetes API standards or anything like that. That wouldn't really make sense, I don't think, for that. But yeah, I'm not sure. Do you have a specific question on it? Give me more specifics. Like, what are you concerned about or wonder about? As far as things like Docker files versus container files, like the naming or the format in there, I don't really worry too much about that. I've always stuck with Docker as a build tool or anything that's Docker based, meaning BuildKit. And a lot of the tools out there use BuildKit, which is what Docker uses now Docker invented this sort of builder version 2 called BuildKit years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. And they've slowly integrated it with all their things. So now if you're using the latest and greatest, now Docker Compose uses it, Docker uses it, and there's plenty of other tools out there that use it as the back end. So essentially, your image is getting built the same way. And one of the things that it has done that I have not talked about or updated in my courses yet is very recently on the Docker blog, they talked about, they have new formats. So they have these experimental formats of features they're adding into the Docker build process. And I'm seeing if I can't find it really quick. Anyway, so if you search on the Docker tag BuildKit, one of the things, and this is a little bit off topic, but one of the things that's happening here is that Docker continues to experiment with what you can do in a Docker file or in a container file, whatever you want to call it, right? And they continue to experiment in BuildKit. Now, it's not industry-wide support. You kind of have to use BuildKit as the core underlying builder to get some of these experimental features, but they're actually quite useful. And there's some really new stuff that only happened in the last few weeks. I saw that they have a, github.com, Docker. It might not be under here. BuildKit, yeah. So in here, yeah, they just had a new release 8 days ago, and there's stuff in here that's really nerdy and detailed, but there's things that are happening that could do things like reduce the size of our images or allow us to basically slice or stick in a layer that's outside of the path so that you don't break cache of every other layer by a higher layer needing updates. I mean, there's just some really interesting stuff that they're experimenting with. So watch this space if you're someone who really focuses on the build environments and how you build and the speed of your build and the size of your images and all that stuff. And so there's some interesting compression stuff going on. Anyway, it's funny. It's one of those things we all thought it was done, but there's a lot that could happen, right? Adding new options into some of the build commands inside of a Docker file so that you can do extra things inside the Docker file is a part of this experimental stuff. Now, again, it's not industry-wide standard, but once the image is built, it's still a standard image. It doesn't mean that your runtime or your registry are special. It just is the build time tool of choice that matters. So if you build with BuildKit tools and then you ship to Harbor and then you run in Containerd or Cryo on Kubernetes, that's all fine. It'll all totally work because they're not changing the format of the resulting image. They're changing how they build it, making it more efficient, faster, leaner, all that. So check that out. I will send you the link of releases here in case people are really interested in that. Also, just read some of the BuildKit Docker blog stuff because I bet you will learn something about your own builds that you didn't know, like a way to use SSH keys and SSH agents inside your builds, a way to mount volumes in your builds, a way to make it leaner and more efficient when you're building. So there's some pretty good stuff there. I also have some stuff in some of my courses about it, but this blog list is pretty good. Hello, beautiful people. Welcome. I'm glad everyone's late, that you're still joining. You can still be late and join. Let's see what else questions we have here. Yes, an amazing icon library. Yeah, so we were talking about Accelodraw a while ago. When you're in there, if you go to the library and browse libraries, you go to this. Oh, it's a page, and so far I've checked. I'm not sure if they're enforcing this, but I believe all of these are open source, meaning MIT or some open licensed, because you do worry about that. If you're making material that others are going to consume, and as a content creator, I always want to respect other content creators' intentions, so I always try to follow the licenses of any content I'm consuming or using. And the nice thing is, so far, everything I've checked here is all Apache or MIT or Creative Commons licensed or public domain licensed. And people are just making icons, basically using Accelodraw to make things that are reusable. And we've even got Docker images and Kubernetes images in here, which are pretty great. There's actually, I think one of the most popular ones in here is DevOps, actually. It's a DevOps one, which just tells you right now that, us techies are, no DevOps. Total downloads. No? Okay, I was lying. Maybe it wasn't DevOps, but I thought I looked recently and there was one in here. Anyway, check out that tool. If there's tons of other stuff, right? Draw.io and just there's so many tools. But I wanted a tool that was reusable, that I could store the source code, the source of my images somewhere, especially in Git where everything else is at, that I could use on my iPad, which this works great on an iPad, that I can use with other people at the same time, which this also does. That's free with a freemium option, which this also does. There's no limits or inherent, archaic time limits or file storage limits or anything like that. The free version, basically, you just upload and download the files as needed, and you don't really store them in. Their cloud storage is the paid option, and I think that's a great model, because you can still use all the features all day long. You just have to use your own local file storage, and you just sort of upload and download the files. And since they're all can be PNGs now, you can upload those PNGs, re-edit them, download them back as the PNG, and you're done. Kind of cool. Let's see. OpenShift. Mia, let's talk about OpenShift for a second. I have not worked with OpenShift recently. In fact, I just had 2 authors of an OpenShift book on the show a couple weeks ago. So if you go back in the archive a couple of weeks, I had some authors on. We talked about enterprise Kubernetes, and I have not used OpenShift in years. So far, so many years back, like at least version 3, or if not older, that I don't really feel like I could answer a lot of questions specifically about OpenShift specifically. Underneath, it's really all just Kubernetes, so it should work the same as everything else. And Gene, thank you so much. You are most welcome for the courses. I am glad you're learning something, and thanks for being here. Can I use the official WordPress Docker image to connect to a remote MySQL database? Yes, absolutely. The performance may not be great, but yes, absolutely. A container runs on a machine just like any regular process. And by default, they can always go out. They can always access the external networks. So unless you have some sort of corporate firewalls or proxies or firewalls on your host machine that are preventing that, any container running on any system can just go out, right? It can get to the network just like your regular machine can. So it does have its own internal NAT IP address, right, on a private network, but it uses the host NIC to get to the network. So anything that you can get to, including database servers in your data center, or cloud stuff that you might have access to through a VPN, like any of that stuff should work. And that's one of the things that Docker Desktop specifically does well, is it works well over VPNs of all kinds, and does some magic in the background to basically make the packets look like they're coming from the host machine, unlike a lot of other tools that have to just NAT through some virtual interface, and then they don't always work with VPNs that are locked down, right? So yes, absolutely. Use it with a remote database server. Just type in the DNS or IP of that remote system, and you're good to go, right? That would be your environment variable versus another container on that container network. What camera do I use? This is actually an older one. This is a Canon M50. I'm all Canon right now, although Sony looks amazing. I hear lots of good things about Sony. So I'm on a Canon M50, which is a mirrorless, cheaper camera, and it's using a very small lens, a fixed length lens that does basically, let's see, it's the 43 millimeter, but it basically gives me an f-stop of 2, so I can have that nice blurry background. By the way, if you're interested in any of my stuff, any of my hardware, I have a kits site. Let's see, it's yeah, right here, kits.co.Bret Fisher. So all the hardware, I think it's up to date. I think I checked it recently. So I have all my kits for like portable and the studio, and I have another Canon camera that I bought that's a little bit better than this one. I think it's also listed in here, but I use it for portable stuff, like when I'm on the go or I need to travel, or if I want a shot from a different angle or whatever. I use that, and they're basically the same camera. Just this one doesn't do 4K great, and the other one's better at 4K, and it has a better focused, like it identifies your face better or something. It has different algorithms. Anyway, that's about it for the cameras. I'm kind of dumb on them, but they work for me. And I'm USB based. I think it's a big other question that people ask. Everything I have is just plugs in through USB. I do no hardware encoding, no specialized hardware rather, for connecting in. Everything USB. So the Canon's coming in through USB, mic's USB. This is the new Shure mic that actually does USB as well as XLR. So I choose a USB because it allows me to do everything in software. And then it's very portable. I can take it for conferences. I can take it on the road, because you'll see me do this show from wherever I'm at, whether it's the Airbnb I'm staying in or the family's house somewhere else. I do this show on the road too, so I need it to be portable. Oh, I can find the icons in their GitHub. Okay. Yeah, and there are there's some really good Kubernetes ones. It's amazing how many people are posting a Kubernetes logo. So it's one of those things where the tool wasn't targeted to anyone in DevOps, but clearly it's a top of mind for people making diagrams now. It's like Node.js, Docker, and Kubernetes, and like Ansible. It's an infrastructure stuff, right? It's like I do think I saw a Golang one in there, or another one. Can you talk about combination of Docker with Kubernetes support in future? Do we need to stick with Containerd and CRI-O? So as of like right now, you can on 122, right? I think it's up to 122. You can still use Docker daemon, the engine. Once 123 comes out, you just need to shift to basically a fork of that, and that's the Mirantis one. Docker shim. So basically Mirantis is now supporting all that. So absolutely, you can still use a Docker experience with the Docker daemon with Kubernetes for the foreseeable future in any version. You just need to switch out your installation method. So you're no longer going to be installing the Docker daemon from the Docker IO package. You're now going to be using Mirantis, because you remember 2021, 2.5 years ago, Docker split. Docker sold off all of its enterprise bits, all of its enterprise people, which is majority of the company, to Mirantis. So Mirantis is now the equivalent of like Docker Enterprise. That's what, Mirantis was around. They were doing Kubernetes before that, but they bought all that off, all the intellectual property. And one of the things they bought, several things they bought actually, were, for example, the Docker, I think it's like the Docker daemon for Windows on Windows Server they now maintain, and they're now maintaining the Docker shim for Kubernetes, and mostly because they need to use that in their own enterprise products. So their own Kubernetes enterprise solution supports what they call the Mirantis engine now. But anyway, this blog post, I'll put it in here for you, explains what's going on. You basically just go to a new GitHub repo and get the instructions on how to install this new daemon, and then you're done. So it still is functionally equivalent to the prior Docker engine and will be maintained to be on par or better than Containerd and CRI-O in some ways, and then sometimes CRI-O and Containerd have advantages as well, right? It kind of just depends on what you're doing. And I think that you will know when you need it. If you run cron, or sorry, not cron, if you run cryo or containerd as your preferred runtime, and there's something that you end up not being able to do, then you might want to check out a different runtime. For example, containerd can do things like encrypt images at rest. I'm not sure why you would need to do that, but if you need to, it can do that. And Docker has some features around using it as a build server, so that people that use Kubernetes to build their containers and they don't want to run like Docker in Docker or any sort of difficult solution like that. By the way, there are newer, better tools that help you with that. But if you're someone who just wants to use the container engine on the host, Dockerd tends to be preferred there because other container engines don't build, right? They're just the runtime, whereas Docker is more than that. So everyone has their reasons. I don't have a preference. It's really just what tool you need for the right job, right? You just solve the problem and move on. So yeah, check that out. That's a great question. Does Confluence have a plugin for Accelerator? I don't know. I don't actually know. What I did notice is I talked about this a month ago, is that Google Cloud now has an editor. I don't know how to describe this. They're using Accelerator as a way for you to diagram out your infrastructure in Google Cloud and then implement it. So it basically turns the diagram into code, infrastructure code, that it then implements for you. And I haven't tried it yet, but search around, see if you can find it. I actually don't know that I have the show notes, I think, from my last show. Let me just see if I can find that, because that's the only integration I've seen. Let's see. I think this was the last one. And Google Cloud Architecture Diagramming. So yeah, here we go. So this one's kind of interesting, that you basically, it's clearly Scala. They don't say it specifically, I don't think they mention it, but they're, by the way, I think it was someone from Google that originally started the open source project for Scala, I think, if I remember correctly. So it makes sense. But you drag and drop things in, and then you apply the infrastructure, one-click deploy to Google Cloud from an architecture tool, which, fantastic. I love it. I mean, there are days where I do nothing but sitting in a shell, but there are some times where I just would rather see something, and this is a really neat thing. So I'm going to put that in chat for you again, but I mentioned that the last Q&A we had, which was about a month ago. Let's see. Oh, it's a birthday? Wow. Anis, welcome. Thanks for being on the show, and happy birthday. You get the reggae horn for your birthday. I hope you have a great one, and maybe have a pint of Guinness. All right. Hope I didn't miss any of these questions. Hello, hello. Yeah, staging and production should use different databases. Yeah. You just want your local DB the same as staging. Yeah, totally. In fact, I was just on a call yesterday with a client, and we were talking about that exact thing. That it's totally expected for you to be able to run containers in Docker or Kubernetes, and then maybe the database isn't in that cluster. It's just somewhere else. I mean, this is what happens by default in the cloud. This is what I recommend in the cloud. I don't recommend running your own databases in the cloud when you've got teams and teams of experts that design a database solution for you that's redundant and backed up and monitored and maintained and all that stuff, right? Like, it just saves you time. I know people don't do it sometimes because it's either just for testing or it's for cost, but I always prefer using someone else's hosted database versus my own, which means it's not in cluster. One of the things you can do, here's a pro tip: if you're going to do Kubernetes in cluster, if you're going to do Kubernetes in production, when you're in the cluster and you're creating your YAML, sometimes what you can do is you can change in case you may ever need to change the DNS hostname, you can actually create a service that has, it's basically the back end of that service. This is all in the documentation in Kubernetes on the website. You can create a service that you essentially are creating a DNS name for a DNS name. So you're only creating a service to point to that external resource. And the goal of that is that when that backend resource ever needs to change, all you need to do is update the service rather than change the environment variables in all your pods and then have to redeploy all your deployments because that one URL changed. If you create that service with no, let's see, I'm trying to think, it's an entryless service. Someone in chat's going to know the answer to this. If you look up the service documentation, there's different types of services, right? We have cluster IP, load balance, and node port, and all that stuff. But one of them has none of those. And really, to me, one of the main purposes of that is when I have an external resource that may possibly change in the future, the IP address changes or the DNS name might change, and I don't want to have to go changing a bunch of environment variables in all my pods. I put that service in the middle to act as DNS only. It's basically a DNS alias, and that means I'm managing my pods and their DNS to external resources in cluster, so I can change in cluster resources rather than having to change all my pods and restart them because some environment variable changed or something like that. So someone will know the type of service that is and help me remember. Is there a way to run a shell command in every container on a specific stack service? Also, what do you do when mounted files have to be present and up to date on every worker in Swarm? Okay, two questions. We're talking about Swarm for a second. So yes, I have an example for the first question. To run a shell command in every container on a specific stack or service. Yes, kind of. Basically, what you want to do is you're going to create a actually, the example I think I have is to run a command on every host at the host level by using a service that bind mounts the Docker daemon from the host, basically the socket. If you want to run a command into every container, there's probably a way to do it, but I don't think I have an example of that. Anyway, I will give you this to start with, and you can go from there. So DockerCon 19 is the URL there. So my DockerCon 19 presentation, actually, no, it's not that one. I think it's dog versus cat. Sorry, so it's a different repo. Dog versus cat, which years ago, when I was doing Swarm talks, I was talking about some of this stuff. And here is an example of creating a service that bind mounts the socket at the host level. So that basically means anything you do with the Docker command inside that service, inside the containers of that service, will actually run against the host's Docker engine, and then I run a command that runs Docker commands. So it's essentially the equivalent of, and then I make it a global, right? I make it a global. So that basically means that's basically going to run this command as root on the host on every node. So you could technically maybe do this and then have it shell into the container of, I don't know. That would be a pretty creative script that you would have to do there. But I will send this one to you, and you can check that out at your leisure. It may help, it may not. On your second question, what do you do when bind-mounted files have to be present and up to date on every worker in the Swarm? Well, this is one of the reasons why you shouldn't use bind mounts in Swarm. Bind mounts are inherently node specific. So you could do what I just showed you, and you could run that command from the host that maybe downloads a new file from somewhere and overwrites the file on each host. But that's why I don't recommend bind mounting. Really what you should be using is secrets and configs, right? You should be putting those in and they're stored then in the Swarm database, just like Kubernetes stores it in the etcd database, right? And that way, when you update them in a central location. So you probably had a reason not to do that, but I'm just telling you anyway. In your experience, is DevOps engineer expected to design and implement a CI/CD pipeline where there is none? Yes. Every DevOps job is different, and DevOps engineer is a very generic term. It's kind of like saying software engineer. Doesn't really mean anything because you could be doing completely different stuff on completely different hardware with completely different software languages, right? A software engineer can be a tester. They may not be writing code, but testing it, right? So DevOps engineer is just as generic. It's super generic. So yes, I would say that most people I know that have a title with DevOps in it are somehow related to something through what I'm not going to call the CI/CD pipeline anymore. It is the automation pipeline because it's doing lots of things, right? It's not just testing. It's not just deploying. It's linting. It's gating, as we call it. It will stop and require a human approval at certain points, and then it'll automate a bunch of other things, right? It sets up Kubernetes clusters. It tears them down. It deploys code. It tears it down. So it's building, not just testing, right? It's building images. It's pushing images. It's scanning images for CVE vulnerabilities. These are all automation tasks. So as an industry, I hope we just move away from that term just because it's very limiting and it is two small pieces of the automation puzzle that you, the DevOps person, tend to manage. Doesn't mean you should. There are certainly teams where their attitude is, no, that's the build team that does the CI infrastructure. We are the DevOps team and we only do something else. But I would say in general, DevOps are all about, basically, if it's automation, a DevOps engineer is probably involved, right? Whether it's automation for stuff on servers that are more ops centric, or it's building images and testing them, which is more on the dev side, it goes back and forth, hence the term, right? So thanks for that question. That's a great question, by the way. How do I highlight people's comments on screen while streaming? Oh, that little thing that just happened there, that is my software that's for streaming, and I use Ecamm Live, which is a Mac-only tool, and I love it. I've used it for 2.5 years, I think, and I'm a huge fan of it. It's great. Thank you, Ecamm Live. Thank you. How do you get started in Kubernetes? I find it a bit confusing. Any pure beginner-friendly resources would be really helpful. My courses are designed for that. So if you're relatively new to containers or maybe you need to brush up on Docker, look below in the description. There's links to coupons for all my courses, including Docker Mastery, which teaches you it teaches you Docker and then teaches basics of Kubernetes as well as a bunch of other things. Or Kubernetes Mastery, which teaches you the basics of Kubernetes. If I called the course Kubernetes Basics, not many people would buy it. So both of those courses will teach you the fundamentals of Kubernetes, assuming you don't know anything. The thing about Kubernetes Mastery is it assumes you know everything about Docker. Like you know how to build images, make images, deploy images. You know everything about running them. But if you need more of that refresher, take Docker Mastery. Links below. Thanks for that question. And thanks for the recommendation. Yes, my Kubernetes Mastery course. External service. Yes, Maz is talking about it. That's what we were talking about. We were talking about that about 5-10 minutes ago. Is this regarding auto-scaling of nodes? This is regarding the auto-scaling of nodes in AKS. Based on the client credits, if client has sufficient credits, I want AKS to create a node. How to achieve it? I don't know. So based on credits, that means that you have to tie into Azure billing, and I think is that what you're talking about when you say credits? You're talking about Azure credits. I'm not really. No, I don't know. I don't know. What if I cannot connect to the remote database with DNS if they only offer direct access with SSH? Can I SSH in the database instance inside the container and still use the remote DB? No. the only thing I can think of is that you do some sort of SSH tunnel and you somehow get the database to go through that tunnel, and you could probably use something like ncat and some sort of hardcore Linux utilities to make this happen, where you're basically mapping a localhost port in the container to the database container listening port on localhost on a remote machine, and using SSH as essentially a VPN tunnel there. I don't know off the top of my head exactly how you would make that work, but I have friends that are way more Linux geeky at that level that would use some probably low-level tools like ncat to achieve that, as well as SSH tunneling tools to basically map a local port to a remote port through an SSH tunnel. Yeah. Great question. Throwing out the hard ones today. I appreciate it. Thank you. Docker in Docker. Yes, that is a thing. DIND. I'm not sure what that is in reference to. Sorry, I'm a little behind on the chat. Is there any requirements in terms of minimum network speed for geographically distributed Kubernetes nodes? This is a very good discussion. I should bring on all my Kubernetes people and we talk about it. So the general rule that I have had for the entire time of container orchestration, so 7 years, has been if it's less than 10 milliseconds. If you can ping, if the round trip is less than 10 milliseconds, essentially, then I think it's sufficient for most things. But that's not usually the case. If you're talking about remote data centers that are outside of like AWS zones, if you're talking about two regions, that's not usually ideal. And the one thing you definitely don't want to do is separate out your control plane nodes across those. Control plane nodes are supposed to be well connected on the same subnets or similar or routable subnets to each other, and they should be really low ping times, right? So definitely they're below 10 milliseconds. What if you don't do that, what you're going to start having is basically where the etcd master nodes that are being split up will start having enough lag that they may elect a new manager, or master is what we used to call it, basically the main node of that 3-node replica. So you definitely want your control plane to be in one region, right? Across multiple availability zones, but in one region. If you need workloads that are outside, it's totally possible, right? You could put a node out there, put some constraints on it, some taints and stuff so that other workloads don't run on it, and then only the workloads you mean to run on it. And they, of course, will have to know and be okay with the fact that there's this latency. You do need to have a VPN between them because Kubernetes expects a flat IP subnet, right? Like Kubernetes, and without, at least by default, in the default Kubernetes, you need to have a flat IP subnet scheme so that all pods can reach other pods, services can reach all other pods, right? That needs to be a flat network. And there are a bunch of Kubernetes networking plugins, CNIs, that you can use. So there may need to be something that you use there to achieve that in your scenario. Now, the other option is that you consider simply doing another Kubernetes cluster, because what is happening in the world of Kubernetes right now is that we're going multi-cluster. Like everyone's multi-cluster. Every shop I know running Kubernetes is multi-cluster, right? They have a staging cluster, testing cluster. They maybe don't align they don't necessarily run a test cluster for testing workloads, because from an ops perspective, if I have to deliver services with my Kubernetes clusters and other people are expecting those clusters to be up, then that means my clusters are all production, right? Just because it's test workloads running on top of it for the customer, if the test workloads go down and they complain to me, that's a production cluster for me. So I'm the operator. So what I mean when I say test and staging and stuff like that, it's like testing Kubernetes clusters themselves, right? If you want to test new Kubernetes releases, you're going to have your own cluster. Plus, a lot of companies, rightfully so, split up all their production clusters so that you don't end up with one giant production cluster. You usually want to split that up. And people split that up for various reasons. One of the main reasons is multi-region. So if I have a region on the east U.S. coast, East Coast US, and then I have one in Europe, Central Europe, and then I have another one in South America. I am going to make clusters for each one of those locations, and a lot of the tools now are meant to be multi-cluster. And there's now even proxy tools that layer on top of things like Contour that allow you to update one cluster that will trickle down to other clusters in certain ways. So look at the tooling you're using and decide if you can support multi-cluster, because that may be the better thing. Even if, depending on that node, maybe that node is an edge node, which we talk about sometimes on this show. Edge nodes, edge clusters, using K3s keys, like some of these smaller Kubernetes distributions. When you do that, that may just be a single node Kubernetes cluster, because if that node goes down, the workload goes down, it's not like it can run anywhere else anyway, right? If it's only one machine you can run out there, it's not like the pods are going to schedule somewhere else. They have to be out there. So that's an edge node, which means that it's not going to be redundant necessarily, because you have hardware limitations for existence. Maybe you're running in all the McDonald's, or you're running in cell phone towers, right? And you have to run a little tiny device in a cell phone tower. So that's not going to be redundant, which means it can be an edge cluster. It's running a small version of Kubernetes, and you're just managing that remotely. What we're seeing now in the industry is a bunch of tools, management tools, replication tools, all this kind of stuff that are helping you manage tens, hundreds, thousands of Kubernetes clusters. And they might just be single node edge clusters, but they're clusters none the same, right? So tools like Fleet, Rancher's Fleet, do this. They were designed out of the box. I think they claim 10,000 clusters or something supported by one tool. Anyway, there's stuff like that. So I went on and on that answer. Hopefully that helps. Hopefully I didn't talk too long. Who uses Swarm? Tons of people still use Swarm. People still buy and take my Swarm course. It still works. It works as well as it did 3 years ago, right? So it just doesn't have any new features. Doesn't mean it's not a viable tool for some people when they have very small requirements. I do tend to recommend Kubernetes to everyone now, because it is the tool of choice. And my main objection with Kubernetes 3 or 4 years ago was that it was hard to deploy and manage. And we now have better tooling, right? The releases have slowed down, so we don't have to have such a rapid pace, at least. We now have better management tools to deploy it. So there's all sorts of great ways to deploy it and maintain it and upgrade it. All the clouds now have a way to run it without you ever touching it or ever having to deploy nodes. So there's a lot of the reasons that I had back in the day for not using Kubernetes were gone. And once you've learned it, right? Once you've understood some of the core principles of Kubernetes, you're done. So yes, it is complicated compared to Swarm. But I still say try both for people that are very small beginner like workloads and they just have one server. I know companies that I work with that are using Docker even without Swarm or with Swarm on single node deployments or on 2 or 3 node deployments in non-critical locations, or they're just getting started with their company and they're not ready to learn Kubernetes yet, but they've learned Docker and they want to try to use Docker. Nothing wrong with that. They may know that their eventual plan is to use Rancher or VMware or Tanzu or whatever. They may know that, but they're just sort of stepping into it, and that's fine with me. Until Docker officially says we're no longer maintaining Swarm and we're taking it out of Docker, which, by the way, you can use Swarm without Docker. Most people don't know that. But if you go to the SwarmKit repo, it gets commits. It gets not near as much as you would want it to have, but it does get a few things. And you can run it without Docker. You just have to, if you don't have Docker, then you have to sort of set up some stuff on the back end and do a couple extra steps. But it is possible for it to live on in some fashion without Docker as a separate project that you just install Docker, then you install Swarm. I haven't seen anybody recommending that, but if there was people that were passionate about it, they might be able to do that. It's all open source. We can fork it. But I know what you're saying, Manvidar. I know you're just joking with me. That was still funny. Who uses Swarm? I want to automate my private registry cleanup, like only recent 5 images which are pushed and images which containers are used. How can I implement this? This is a great question. Thank you, Aman. Great question. I don't have a complete solution for you, but I know the tool you should check out. You like my little espresso cup? A friend of mine made this by hand. Hi, Kelly. So, yeah, she has a web shop now. I should get the URL, and whenever I use her cup, I should pimp her stuff on the internet. If you're into pottery and stuff like that. So we're going to look up this tool that another Docker captain makes. I got to find it first. Basically, there are, I don't know of very many built-in ways. Harbor might have this. So we're focusing on the question of keeping your image registries clean. So there's such a thing called garbage collection in registries, but that's mostly about deleting layers from images that have been deleted. So it assumes that you've deleted images. But what if you only want so many images? Or, like in my example, when I'm building images and storing them in a registry temporarily for testing during a PR process, I want those testing images that are tagged specifically for that PR to go away when the PR is either closed or merged, right? So, sudo bmitch. All right. So if we go over to Brandon Mitchell's repo, and sorry, I'm not sharing screen. So Brandon Mitchell sometimes shows up on the show, and Docker Captain, and actually has this great tool called Reg Client. So there's two tools here. I'm trying to make sure I have the right one because he has a bunch of tools here. Yeah. So this tool is meant to be used for exactly the kind of scenarios you're talking about. It is a command line tool that gives you fancy options for interacting with registries from an automated perspective. So you can use this on your local CLI to do things, or you can plug it into your workflows, GitHub Actions, whatever, Jenkins, and you can run this tool remotely. Let's see. Let me see here if I can find. Delete APIs have been provided for tags, manifest, and blobs. So basically, you can tell it to delete certain things, and it will go and do whatever it needs to do in the registry, including multiple API calls to get that done. So it's got some intelligent built in, and there are multiple ways to use it. And it's kind of a remote registry management tool, mostly for dealing with the images and those tags inside that repo. So it's more full feature than the Docker command line is. Now, Docker has their own tool called Hub Tool, I think is what it's called. I think it comes with, yep, Hub Tool. You need to be logged into Docker Hub that uses this tool. Okay, so Hub Tool is another one. It's officially from Docker. Yeah, so they had this experimental CLI tool, but from at least from what I know, Brandon's registry or reg client is better. And actually, I just realized it's in its own organization. Yeah. So you got reg client. Did I put that in there? Yeah, reg client. And then you can look at the Docker Hub tool. Basically, it's hub-tool from the command line. And it does some things, but I'm not really sure if it's getting a lot of new features. I know that's just it was experimental. Not sure on that. Great questions. All right. Thanks, Martin. Thanks on the details on the external service, essentially. Is it just you that uses Swarm in production? I think I said all that, but no, not at all. I think there's plenty of people that do. I mean, up until very, very recently, technically today, I have a Swarm cluster in production. Because if you use my courses and you're in the Slack for those courses, there's some automation bots that sit in there, and they've been running for 3 or 4 years on a DigitalOcean 3-node Swarm cluster. And I go in there every couple of months, do security updates, update the latest Docker, reboot them all. And it's been working great. It's been working fine. Can we hope for a simpler Kubernetes alternative in the future, or will there be an orchestrator monopoly for a long time? So there's tons of other orchestrators that you can use. Nomad is probably the number one at this point, the number one alternative. If you're on AWS, you can use ECS, not EKS, but ECS. I think the answer is no. So, like, resistance is futile, right? I have the green in the background. It's for St. Patty's Day, but it could also be for the Borg, and the Borg in Star Trek, which are making a comeback in the new Picard show. If anybody's a Star Trek fan, very happy about that. Not spoilers, but there's a new season. It's amazing, and the Borg are involved. So no, I think my attitude now is that as a DevOps professional, you will eventually need to learn Kubernetes regardless. And Kubernetes, the API is what is the power for Kubernetes now. When it first started, we really just thought about Kubernetes as a way, at least those of us that were using it, maybe not the original people, but those of us that were using it, were really just trying to solve the problem of, I have 10 servers or 20 or 30 servers now that all run Docker. I need to organize all that and use one command line to orchestrate my container workloads. And then we started to see things pile onto it, right? We started to see networking and storage options. We started to see multiple proxy and then ingress options. And then we started to see, I'm trying to think of all the other things, RBAC, visual designers, GitOps. I mean, all these things that have been layered on top. And the reason that's all happening is because of one thing. It's the Kubernetes API pod or the runtime. The Kubernetes API is becoming the new config DB. Now, if you're a sysadmin or an operator, you know what the config DB is because we've had it, whatever your tool was, right? SMS back in the day, system management server, all the other tools out there that manage your infrastructure, right? That was a very traditional data center mindset where we had a centralized database that was the common way we stored and accessed information about our infrastructure. And we've evolved way beyond that nowadays, especially now that we have the cloud and all that. We have all these different tools out there, SaaS products, open source products. We've got Terraform states, we've got Ansible, we've got these modern tools, and their job is to collect infrastructure and store it, right? Store that information so that you can automate maintenance, upgrades, deployments of infrastructure and all that stuff, right? We get that at the infrastructure level. But what application designers and developers have not had is a consistent application config DB. So that's what Kubernetes has become. Docker didn't do it. Swarm didn't do it. Swarm wasn't an open API. The Swarm API was quite frustratingly closed. I wish it was a better API. For example, Stacks in Swarm have zero API. There is no Swarm API to do things against a stack. The way that Docker does it is the client does it in the background. It turns things into JSON and then does all the fanciness for you. But it's all in the client, not in the API. So that was a failure of Swarm and its ideas. And they wanted to do it. Granted, I'm going to give the team credit. They did want to do it. They just didn't get enough runway and time to do it before things changed at Docker Inc. So what we have now is the Kubernetes API, and that has now become and will continue to be for the foreseeable future the single API that gives us constraints. And I'm calling it constraints right now. It's resources, all those resource types, right? The custom resources, the built-in resources. Those are now the blocks that developers get to play with. So when we now, as an operations team, deploy our infrastructure, eventually what you'll see is, I believe, is that the data centers and the clouds that you're operating in will be almost all Kubernetes based. And the Kubernetes API is now an abstraction. And below it is the infrastructure. That's the ops team's concern. Above that API is the developer concern. Now, the operators are still going to be using the Kubernetes API too, but the point here is that API is now a consistent experience for rolling updates or canary deployments or how a pod should look, how all of my parts of my containers inside a single pod should work together, how my deployments and my stateful set should all work. That's what that API is giving us. And once people, yes, it's complicated. Yes, you have to learn it. But once you've learned that, your team is free to play in that sandbox regardless of which cloud they're in, which data center they're in. Are they in edge? Are they on local machine? Are they in the cloud? Doesn't matter. It's a consistent API everywhere. Doesn't matter if you're on a certain vendor or if you're using a different distribution. It doesn't matter. It's a consistent API. And what we've all struggled with since the invention of the cloud and way before that was a consistent experience regardless of environment. And so the Kubernetes API, as much as the Docker API, the Docker internal API does for running a single workload, right? Because that's what Docker did. They have that single workload. Now Kubernetes has done that for all workloads across a data center and cloud combined, okay? We don't have anything else even close to that, in my opinion. There are vendor-specific iterations of this, but they're vendor-specific. We don't have a vendorless API that I can deploy workloads to, regardless of which machine it's on or which cloud or data center, right? So it is that, and you have to get used to it because it's not perfect, but it's the best thing we've got. And you can deploy Kubernetes in a simple way. You can deploy it in complicated solutions as well. By the way, there's a great podcast on this, and I will pimp someone else's podcast beyond my own. But if you go check out I'm just going to look it up over here. Weaveworks has a podcast called The Art of Modern DevOps. And there's a recent episode, and I am going to show you real quick. You don't have to do this on Apple, obviously, but I'm going to just show you the Apple interface. So this was a great episode in November called Kubernetes Has Won the Enterprise. And what it is Michael Cody, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, and then Joe Beta, there are several of these recently. This is a great podcast, by the way, the Art of Modern DevOps. Art of Modern Ops. And by the way, Weave the company, Weaveworks, they've done a ton in the community for containers. They don't get enough credit. They coined the term GitOps, which I love to use on a daily basis. And they have done lots of deep thinking about infrastructure and applications and how we should do them. So their podcast is really great. And this recent one on Kubernetes Has Won the Enterprise, I think that's the one, talks a lot about what does that mean? What does that mean for the enterprise? And it had this great discussion around this exact thing, that the Kubernetes API is now the data center API, and it's what all developers are now implementing their application designs against. So if they need all these different pieces to make their app work, and they're thinking how they're going to architect it all, they're now thinking in API Kubernetes terms rather than I'm going to just need a bunch of machines to do this, right? They're not thinking of how many machines I need or how many database hosts I need. That's now all removed from them. And they now just have this concern of, oh, well, that's going to be a deployment. I need a stateful set for that. I'm going to need some services for this and 5 ingress rules. And it is limiting, right? That is a limiting set of tools to play with. But what we've learned is that these are the best practice limiting things, right? These are the things that we really need to constrain to so that we can all agree on how we need to deploy applications in a distributed environment rather than everything is possible in every way, which just creates problems down the road because you have too much choice. So sometimes limiting choice by saying it has to be a Kubernetes resource is a good thing because we can now all agree on something, the contract, right? This is the abstract contract between the infrastructure people and the application people. Hopefully that makes sense. That's a great question, David. That really got me on a rant. So how do we implement publish and subscribe AMQP communication between microservices, microservice applications in Kubernetes? I don't have the answer to that. So sorry. Publishing and subscribing is not something that I'm an expert in. I focus more on the operations side, on the infrastructure side of DevOps. I don't spend my time designing internal application, front end to back end communications. I help teams implement that, but I don't really help them architect it necessarily. So, sorry, Jack. Maybe someone else in chat has an answer for that. Oh, you want to issue licenses, not Azure credits. Okay. So this is entirely application dependent. So does it have a license server? I don't actually really know. That's a very custom solution. I'm sorry, I'm not going to have a very specific answer for that. If you're going to have to create some sort of count somewhere and keep track of it. And then before you launch the pods, obviously you got to go do that. And you've probably thought all this through, but I don't really have an answer off the top of my head on that one. That one's kind of tough. Sorry. Right. Yeah, you can't move volumes across clusters. That's a great point in a distributed. Oh, look at that. SoCat. Yeah, so people are making recommendations for you on that VPN. Any advice for beginners would be helpful. Just get started. Just play with things. Be curious. Be curious is probably the number one thing that any beginner has to be. You have to figure out a way to make this inherently interesting to learn. So you need to come up with something that you care about and say, I'm going to implement that as a container. I'm going to use Docker to do this. And you force yourself to learn Docker for doing that thing. That's how I learned it. That's how so many people learned it. I learned it because I had a little startup 8 years ago that I wanted faster testing. I wanted to be able to spin things up and tear them down. And at the time, we were using EC2 instances, entire instances, spinning them up and down. And I wanted something faster than that. So I heard Docker could do that. And I had to learn Docker to implement that. And then I fell in love. And I loved it. And I changed my whole career. So that's how I recommend you do it. Find something you're interested in, do that with Docker, and then find something you're interested in and do that with Kubernetes. That's how I recommend learning all tools. I am personally not a person that goes and learns something that I have no use for yet. I'm not interested enough to read a whole book on something that I don't know if I would ever use it. So I wait until I have a problem. I call it just-in-time learning. Just-in-time learning is how I operate. So I wait till I have a problem. When I have that problem, I quickly go and cram everything I can, and that's what causes me to stay up reading a book late at night, or watching a video, before going to bed, or waking up and drinking my morning coffee and watching YouTube videos. I have to be interested in it. I have to want to solve the problem. So that's me. Everybody's different, though. We all learn differently. So that's my only advice. Can I please explain thin pool issue in Docker? What is it? Thin pool? I don't know what thin pool is. Do I need to Google this? It's a device map storage driver. Okay, so I don't use... So what we're talking about is a device mapper storage driver. You threw me a curveball here. Device mapper storage driver is not something that I use very often. Back in the day, it was only used for Red Hat because they were the ones that were maintaining that driver. Everyone by default uses the, not the AUFS. Overlay 2 is the default. And it's the preferred. I'm not showing you. I'm sorry. I'm not showing you my screen. So we're talking about storage drivers. So let me just back up and tell, for all of you who didn't know, we don't really talk about this deeply in Docker Mastery. I mean, when you're taking the Docker Mastery course, storage drivers are a little bit, they're an edge case nowadays. Back when Docker started, there's this underlying file system that your images and containers all run on. And those are all encapsulated as calling them union storage file systems, right? So they basically take all the different layers and squish them in and make it the OS see them all the layers as one file tree. That's a union file system. And there's different ways to implement that. There's different technologies to implement how that works. And they all have concessions. They all have pros and cons. Some of them are way faster at read, but slower at write. Some are faster at write, but slower at read. Some are really fast on small numbers of layers, but get really slow when there's 100 layers in your Docker image. And these are all now known as storage drivers inside of Docker. So the reality is that in 2022, Overlay 2 is the default and works in almost all scenarios. It works out of the box. It's the default out of the box. Years ago, when Overlay 2 wasn't as good as it is now, and it had more edge cases and problems, we would often recommend other storage drivers for different use cases. So if you were on Red Hat, for example, they recommended you always use Device Mapper. And in fact, the Overlay 2 driver wasn't even installed on Red Hat. So you couldn't, you would have to install that as a Yum package, not Yum package, sorry. Yum package, sorry. Yeah, you would have to install that separately in order to get support for it inside of Docker and then switch to Device Mapper. So Device Mapper has this, I'm assuming what the thin pool is simply that it's not going to reserve the space, but I don't actually know. I would only know what the documentation told me. So if I looked at the Device Mapper storage driver here and looked up the thin pool and thin pool meta, I would have to read what exactly this does, right? And why. There's 36 matches of it here, so it's clearly something that's related to a configuration inside of Device Mapper. But again, I don't know anyone that's using this driver now. So maybe you have good reasons. I'm not saying your reasons are wrong, but I just don't have any clients or users or customers that have used it in the last 3+ years. So you need to know your reasons for why you're choosing that driver. You maybe have already have those reasons. But yeah, great question. Sorry, I don't have a good answer for you. Automation pipeline. Yeah, I mean, to me, a DevOps engineer nowadays, one of their primary focuses is on automation. I automate the human out of the process, and then I go find the next bottleneck. And the bottlenecks are usually somewhere between someone wrote code, production's running that code. There's all this stuff in the middle that has to happen before someone who wrote the code sees it running in front of users. And to me, DevOps largely operates in that realm, right? They're all about the continuing loop of getting the code into production through all the proper steps and then getting feedback from production so that we know whether we did a good job, how we can do better. And you have to do metrics management. You have to monitor yourself, monitor your team, keep track of statistics so that you know if you're getting better. Because just implementing a tool doesn't mean you're better. Doesn't mean the business objectives are being met better. So a lot of people forget about that part, the business objectives and monitoring and measuring things at a business level so that we know, hey, did Kubernetes actually improve our team's performance? Is the business actually operating more efficiently and faster in terms of taking ideas and turning them into software in front of customers? Like if that's not happening, if you don't have a way to measure that, then how do you know DevOps is even good for you? So anyway, that's kind of the thing about DevOps is we all focus on the tools, but tools don't actually matter. All right. I think I'm almost caught up on these questions. Anthos for multi-cluster. All right. Thanks for the recommendation. Has anyone tried running Kubernetes cluster on around 100 small machines? Sure, but what do you mean by small? You got to make sure that your machines are big enough to maintain all the resources that Kubernetes has to run on that node, because it has binaries it has to run too. And then it has to run the container engine. And usually that runs other things like, containerd runs runc. So you've got these other things for every pod and container you run. There are a bunch of other resources that have to be there. So the only question is not the size of your node, but does your node have enough resources, memory, CPU, and disk, and networking to be able to do the work that you're asking it to do? So that rule hasn't changed. That rule was there before Kubernetes. And Kubernetes is just the management engine that manages all those machines. If you're running something very lean like K3s or keys, then that would require less resources and you could maybe run on smaller machines. The one thing that most people don't give enough consideration to, I think, is networking. Because when you're running everything distributed, networking is now the lifeblood. It's the backbone of how all those things communicate. And if you're on AWS and you use really small micro mini machines, those have horrible networking. So if you start to see issues that often could be, look at your networking, see if you're monitor your networking throughput and see if you're hitting those limits, because AWS isn't super clear out of the gate of showing you like where is your cap and like what your networking looks like. And people often just focus on memory and CPU. And then they usually only worry about disk when it fills up, and then they suddenly care. But what you really should be also looking at is your networking, because I honestly, one of the things I love about these new Graviton instances in AWS, I'm picking on AWS for a minute, is that those come out of the box with 10 gigabit networking, no matter the size, which is awesome, because 10 gigabit at this point, for most of us, is enough, right? So we can run big machines, small machines, doesn't matter, and those ARM Graviton 2s and have all the networking out of the way. Like the networking basically, to me, in my opinion, if you're running in one region and you have all ARM and everything's 10 gigabit networking, you can just kind of at that point assume networking's fine. Unless you're doing really crazy stuff like video distribution or whatever, networking for most of us will just be fine. And we can not necessarily ignore it, but it's not something I would be paranoid about like I would with small or micro instances on the cloud. So check that out. Yeah, Raspberry Pis. That's great tips. Thank you all for that. All right. So we've been going an hour and a half. If anyone doesn't have any other questions, I'm going to wrap it up. So remember, okay, this is what's coming soon. Next week, I've got Pulumi on the show. We've got Raw Code from his YouTube channel. Going to be on the show next week, and we're going to talk about Pulumi for GitOps stuff. That's David Flanagan, but you can find him here on YouTube under Raw Code, RAWKODE, I believe. And then after that, we're going to have HashiCorp on talking about some of their projects. And after that, we've got Shippa coming next month. This is every Thursday. And so I have guests a lot of the time. And then once a month, we do this only Q&A thing where you get to ask all the questions and I hopefully have some answers. And then, of course, on Fridays, the podcast comes out. Links below for the podcast. So the podcast comes out on Friday, and it's prior episodes that have been edited down to just the essentials of the discussion. And, of course, you can find my course links below with the best coupons. And you can sign up for my Patreon and support this show, the open source that I have, all the examples I have for DevOps stuff, as well as the podcast. It's all sponsored by Patreon, and you can support me by spending a couple of bucks and buying me a coffee every month. I really appreciate it. And thank you to the patrons. There's over 100 of you that are supporting this show. I really appreciate your work. All right. Last check on questions. Looks like my chat sync is broken. All right, I'm missing some of the questions. Sorry about that. Is there an easy way to automate the installation of VMs containers on OpenShift? Automate the installation of VMs and containers on OpenShift, something like Kickstart files. I don't know what Kickstart files are. I don't think I've used those. I mean, the goal I think really that all of us are moving towards is GitOps approaches. So that means you're defining everything in either Kubernetes YAML, but you're probably doing Helm or Customize. And then that's in a Git repo. And then you need to apply those to environments, right, with environment overrides. So that's what you use Argo CD, ARGO CD, or Fleet, or Flux CD, or just Flux. These are different tools that apply. Basically, they take the YAML templates you've created and they apply them to clusters from inside the cluster. So those operate inside your cluster. I don't know if OpenShift has a built-in one. Maybe it does. But these GitOps approaches allow a declarative-based approach, which means you're deciding what you want to have happen and you're letting the cluster decide how it's going to happen. That's declarative. That's what we all want. So you're using those tools to override the templates, and then they can apply those inside the cluster. So the cluster itself will start monitoring a Git repo for changes and then downloading those changes, so that the only thing you have to do as an operator is just go change some YAML in GitHub or Bitbucket or GitLab, whatever, right? You're not touching the cluster itself. You're never running command lines. You're just editing YAML. It applies it into the clusters automatically, however many clusters you have, however many times. So if you're not familiar with that approach, go looking around for GitOps. I talk about it a lot on this channel. A lot of my recent examples on GitHub, if you check out my GitHub, a lot of those examples are about GitOps approaches to automated deployments and automated building of images. So you can just find those at github.com/Bret Fisher. So hopefully that helps. Liben, sorry if I mispronounced that. That was for you. Abdul, sharing volumes on Kubernetes. I'm not sure if people are giving you advice, but sharing volumes on Kubernetes, you need to, so there's different types of persistent volumes in Kubernetes, and storage, this is going back to storage originally. Storage has always had these concepts of read only, read write one, and read write many. That's hard to say. So in other words, different storages have different capabilities, and some storages can only be connected to one node at a time, in other words, one pod at a time, and some have read-write many, which means multiple containers can all connect to that. So what you want to look up is CSI, Container Storage Interface. I believe that's what that stands for. So CSI is the way that Kubernetes talks to different types of storage. So step one is understand your application storage requirements. Does it need volumes for each pod? Do the pods need to share volumes? Do the containers need to share volume inside the pod? Understand that architecture. What are the requirements of the application? Then if you go to the Kubernetes documentation and you look up storage, you will find them talking about CSI and the different types like read-write one, read-write many, read-only, stuff like that, right? And then that will help you to figure out what types of storage you're allowed to use. And then you have to figure out the storage backend. If you're in the cloud, then you have to use that cloud's backend storage. If you're in a data center, then you have to figure out, do I want to replicate my storage between nodes? Do I want to use some external storage like Dell or NetApp or something like that provides hardware-based storage elsewhere outside of your cluster? Those all have their own CSI drivers, plugins, and you get to connect those. So the bottom line is you need to understand what your capabilities, what your requirements are of your app. Then you figure out which CSI drivers you even can use based on what storage you actually have. And if you have no external storage, then that means you have to use something that replicates the data between nodes and gives you that fault tolerance of storage there. And then that means you're going to have to use something like Rook or Longhorn. Rook is a project. You can look up Rook in Kubernetes. And there's the Longhorn project made by Rancher, which is another one. Those two, by the way, Rook is really just Ceph, right? There's Ceph underneath it, but Rook helps you deploy Ceph. But Ceph is a tool that lets you connect a bunch of different machines and replicate that storage for redundancy. But then you have to also understand that storage doesn't solve application problems magically. So if you have a database and you need redundant databases, then you need 3 or 2 databases that synchronize and replicate inside that database engine. That has nothing to do with replicated storage. For example, you can't just simply replicate a volume for a MySQL and then connect it to two MySQLs. That won't work because MySQLs, the way these traditional database SQL engines work is that they have their own file storage, and when you set up two of them, each one of them has their own file storage. The file storage doesn't replicate, the database engines do. So that's another really important point, is that applications have their own requirements, and you need to really understand those first before you go looking for storage. That's a great question, though. I get a lot of storage questions, and it's hard. It's hard because Kubernetes doesn't solve your storage problems. It simply provides you an abstraction to help you manage the application's requirements and have a standard contract of what is its requirements and what storage do I want to use to serve those requirements. And that's what Kubernetes does for you. But if you're someone who has to implement the storage, it's not any easier. It might even be considered harder than regular storage stuff. So in my case, when you're running on big enterprise companies, they have a storage team. And the storage team will tell you, these are the kinds of storage we have. We have this kind of storage over here, which is NFS storage. This over here, we have iSCSI. And over here, we have Fiber Channel. And over here, we have Windows file shares or CIFS or whatever, right? And they will tell you the types of storage you have, as well as node storage, which is just the hard drive inside of your machine. And you have to figure all that out. That's hard. That's most of the work. So, and that has nothing to do with Kubernetes. That's just storage. Great question, though. I used to run a storage management team, so I had a few years there where I was having to micromanage the storage all day long. Justin's like, AWS here, I'm biased. Sorry, it's like my comments have completely just stopped replicating. So I can't put them on screen anymore. It's like they broke. Any recommendations from Martin on how to monitor networking on Kubernetes with open source? Monitor networking. So if you look like Prometheus, probably the most popular open source tool for metrics on Kubernetes, you can use Prometheus with node metrics that will give you networking metric endpoints that you can then basically write rules in Prometheus to pull that data out. It doesn't come all perfect out of the box. That's kind of the thing with open source, is you kind of have to build it. But you can look for other people's Prometheus guides that show you how you would do that kind of thing with networking that would maybe make it a little bit easier. You're probably going to need CAdvisor or something else to pull those metrics out of the nodes and out of the containers and then feed that over to Prometheus. I'm spitballing here. I don't actually know for certain. Do I remember Windows Longhorn? Of course. I ran Windows Longhorn. What are you talking about? See all this gray in this beard? I didn't get this gray because I'm old. I got this gray because I've been a sysadmin too long and I have to deal with all that stuff. But yeah, Windows Longhorn. Those were good days. And then they weren't. Alexander's asking, do you tool better than KOps to deploy Kubernetes cluster on cloud infrastructure? Are there better tools than KOps? I think to this point, I don't know, because what I end up tending to deal with is very vendor specific tooling, so KOps is a vanilla upstream deployer, as far as I remember. I haven't used it recently, but most teams choose a vendor for their Kubernetes. They choose a distribution of Kubernetes. I don't actually know anyone, and I don't recommend people run business production clusters on open source upstream unless they are Kubernetes pros, meaning they have years of experience running Kubernetes clusters full time, and those people know exactly how to make a great Kubernetes cluster, and they have reasons not to choose Tanzu or Rancher or whatever, right? They have reasons for not doing that or not using the clouds. So, for example, EKS has its own tool, its own official tool for managing it. So in that case, I'd use that one. Rancher has RKE. It has its own tool to manage deployments for Rancher. And so most of them all do that. They all have their own tool. So I don't actually like KAdmin. The only way I actually use KAdmin today is through other tools that use it underneath. The other tool goes on top of it because KAdmin won't even install Docker for you, right? So there's other tools that run on top of it. So if you're happy with KOps, great. The nice thing is that it is vendor agnostic, so you don't have to use a different tool for a different environment. But I don't have a lot of experience with it because again, when I operate in real world with customers, they're picking a distribution and using that distribution's tools. Recently, I've started using COTS a little bit. COTS is another distribution. I'm sorry, not COTS, curl. Curl.sh. This is basically it's a build your own installer. It uses upstream native, vanilla Kubernetes, and then you kind of choose. You can actually this is a pretty new feature. You can actually choose your distribution. But if you just use kubeadmin, it's native vanilla, and then you can say I want containerd, give me weave networking, I want contour for my ingress, I want cluster administration tooling, maybe I want fluentd for logs, and then I want Minio or MinIO storage, depending on how you want to pronounce it, Longhorn, because I like that, Prometheus for my monitoring. Right? So I can kind of choose my stuff, and then it gives me, over on the right, it puts all that in YAML and gives me a one-line install. So it gives me a custom deployable solution using a one-line installer, and I can even do air gaps where I basically can put it on a cluster that doesn't have internet access. So it's a pretty neat project. It is technically its own distribution, but underneath, it's really just using other people's installers, right? But in the case of like kubeadmin, since kubeadmin doesn't support controlling some of the other things that it needs, like Docker or containerd, or it doesn't do any of the things that go on top of Kubernetes, like you're going to need an ingress provider, you're going to need all the storage providers and stuff like that. So you need something beyond kubeadmin. Kubeadmin is a little low level for that, right? So I'm not saying this is the best one. I'm just saying it's one that I have used recently and it works well for my use case. So, all right, SG707. I'm reading your question real quick. My coworker is considering to use Minikube as a development environment, but I think Docker Compose is better. Do you think both are good solutions, or is one better than the other? This is like a flame war potential topic. So my opinion is Docker Compose all the way, man. I am 100% Docker Compose for local development. People have completely different opinions. For example, Kelsey Hightower, one of the founders of Kubernetes and one of the proponents and advocates of container technology, doesn't advocate developing in containers. But you got to look at his world. He works in statically compiled binary world like Go and Rust, right? Golang is sort of the language of container tooling, and that's the world that he lives in at Google, who invented that language. So you hear him talk about it, and he's like, I don't use containers locally. But the reality is, he may not have to be doing a bunch of Python and PHP and Node.js. And what I am going to get on a soapbox and say I consider pre-cloud native languages, pre-distributed computing languages that weren't taking these concepts they weren't using these concepts when they were created. Doesn't mean they're bad languages today, but those languages are very complex for development environments. If you've ever taken my Docker for Node.js course, there's a reason I don't make a Docker for Go course, because it would be so short and so simple that you wouldn't really learn anything that you didn't already know if you're a Go programmer. But Node.js, PHP, Ruby, Python, these languages have a level of complexity. They need host installs. Like you need to use apt and yum to install things before you install them. And then you need to install them and all their different ways to be installed. And then you need to install their packages with their package manager. And then sometimes on languages like PHP and Ruby, you need to run npm as well as their package manager. So now you're running 3 package managers to get your app to work. So those languages are inherently, like sometimes I have 200 or 300 lines in a Docker file for those languages. Golang, never seen it go across 100 lines. Usually way under 50 lines of code in a Docker file. And that's because these statically compiled languages are optimized for the current reality. And if you go back in time and you learn about statically compiled, I'm going on a soapbox moment. Sorry, this will be my last soapbox of the day. But this is the evolution of programming languages. I'm convinced that the future is in Golang and Rust and other statically compiled binary languages. What is an app on your phone? It's delivered to you as a single package with a bunch of files in it, but it's delivered as a single package, right? And that is kind of what the analogous to the concepts of containers, right? We're shipping container images, and we want those container images to be as simple as possible. When we started, go back 30 years, if you go back and read the internet from that, 20 years ago, statically compiled meaning I'm compiling all of my code into one file to run as a single binary. That was traditionally looked as bad. But when you look at the times, disk space was slow. Disk was slow. Disk was very rare. It was not easy to get a terabyte of disk space. So we only wanted to use libraries that we never wanted to recompile a library into 2 separate binaries. So we wanted to save as much disk space as possible and reuse as much as possible. So that was then. That is not true anymore, right? Disk space is plentiful. It's very fast. It's all SSD. We have instant access. In fact, we got to the point now on some of these machines that the SSDs, when you use the eNVMs or whatever these are, all these new things are called, they're almost nearly as fast as RAM. So to the human, it doesn't seem as different to pull an application off of disk than it is if it's already in RAM, right? So now statically compiled binaries are not bad anymore. We solve the problems that we invented library-based file connections, right? Where we all needed Python libraries before we could run our app. Plus, the other thing with dynamically compiled languages like Node.js and Ruby and all those things, they were optimizing for low compute. When they were invented, this was 15, 20 years ago for most of these, that when they were invented, computing was very limited. So we didn't necessarily want to have to load, and memory was very limited. So we didn't want to load the whole thing into memory. We wanted to do it a file at a time, right? We wanted to process things in line. This is my take, right? So that's not true anymore either. What is more important nowadays in the real world today is now that we're shipping every time we change, we're distributing these images all over the place. Every time we change, we're distributing images. So what today seems to be the most efficient way is we have simple and fast builds. We have simpler and faster development life cycles. And then we have these artifacts that we're distributing to all the systems. Because if you're running 3 different Python apps on a server, chances are they're all going to be using different Python versions, which means huge images for each one of those versions. But if I compile a Rust or a Golang binary, it's just that one binary. It's not that big, right? It's like 10 meg, 20 meg. It ain't no 1 gig Python image, which is what I see. I got people with 2 gig Ruby images, right? And it's because we have all this stuff. We have all these requirements, and we're doing it over and over again. So my theory is the future, once people kind of come on board, is that the future languages are Go and Rust, and we will be deploying, they build faster, they deploy faster, they run faster. They're designed for the modern approach to programming and distributed computing. Golang is network first. It's got all that built into it. I think if you look back at the Node.js origins, Node.js was really about file I/O when it was first created. One of the optimizations was about file I/O. Anyway, so current reality, distributed computing, let's focus on that. That's how these new languages started to arise. I'm sure that people don't agree with me on that. That's just my piece of it. And so that is a big, long soapbox to your question, which is Docker Compose, Kubernetes was not designed for development. There are tons of tools that try to do this. Every time I see someone try to implement it, it's not better than Compose. It's not. It's worse, or maybe almost as good. But then it requires a whole nother tool. So in order to get the workflow of I develop, things change, things sync, I have to use some other tool besides Kubernetes, right? Kubernetes doesn't have this built in. So if you're just swapping out another tool with Kubernetes, and that other tool probably needs its own file types or some proprietary vendor-only solution, I just rather use Docker Compose, which comes with Docker out of the box and uses less resources than all those Kubernetes tools. Doesn't make my Intel fans on my Intel CPUs, go crazy just because I'm running a Kubernetes cluster. And it's designed out of the box. Docker is still very focused on developer workflow. So I believe that Docker themselves, all their engineers, all 70 of them or whatever, are still under the belief that there's really not as an efficient way to use Kubernetes as the underlying infrastructure for local development as it is to just have Docker only. So that's the stance I'm taking, and every one of my customers tends to agree. They play around with tools for Kubernetes, but the only thing they're using Kubernetes locally for is to test manifest or to test deployments, basically to test Kubernetes tooling, not to develop on, right? To develop on, they either don't use containers at all or they use Docker Compose. So sorry that was my last soapbox, and I'm going to shut up. Does curl use a Helm file, Moz? It can. Sorry. Curl is for deploying your cluster, not for deploying your apps. So it doesn't have anything to do with Helm. So no. It's just a YAML file that describes the version of Kubernetes you want, what add-ons you want, what container runtime you want. You basically give it the ingredients for how to build your cluster. And then once it's installed, then you can use tools like Helm on top of it because it's just Kubernetes, right? While we're talking about Flame Wars, VI or Emacs. Well, I'm a Vim user, specifically in Vim, but to each their own. I have nothing wrong with Emacs. I just don't know it that well. So I got started with VI probably because whatever machine I was on had it and not Emacs, maybe. I don't know. I got my beginnings with VI back in even before Solaris on HP Unix and AT&T Unix way back in like 80s and 90s. Okay. So I had access to VI. So I used VI, and I think even, I can't remember the other one I used, but yeah, I think it was VI. So. And SG707 says, yeah, I agree with the same thing on Docker Compose. I mean, it's not that you can't use Kubernetes. If you're diehard and you want to do it and you love it and you love that experience and workflow, great. There's a lot of tools out there. There's Scaffold. There's, I don't know. There's probably 4 or 5 tools that I'm not remembering off the top of my head that can all try to use either a remote Kubernetes cluster or a local cluster for development. But I don't find that it saves you any time or there's really any inherent benefit. There's something about us, right, that when we create those Kubernetes manifests, we're like, well, now that I've created these manifests to describe my application running in production or on a server, I want to use these same things to develop with. But the reality is the development is always going to be quite different. Especially when you start talking about microservices, I don't need all 20 microservices. I only need 2, right? When I'm developing on one, I probably need the 1 or 2 that it's talking to. And I don't need everything else usually. Maybe as a smoke test before I push, but I don't need 20 things. If I am, I think it's Kelsey Hightower actually says, if you need 20 microservices to develop on one of them, that's called a distributed monolith. So that's if your dependencies are so bad like that you need everything running, you're just really creating another monolith. So my point there is that I know that with Docker Compose, it's a much smaller file. It can all fit in one file, even for 20 microservices. You can template that thing out, right? You can use override files. There's all sorts of great features in Compose that Kubernetes doesn't have out of the box. So now I'm creating Kustomize and Helm charts, all just so I can develop locally. And then I have to use another third-party tool to only spin up the things I want, to control the replacement of those things, and to like bind mount stuff. And it just it's fine if you want to use it. It's fine. It just seems to me like if you already have Docker and Docker Compose on your machine, and that is completely designed absolutely for developer workflows, why wouldn't you try that first? Like, what's the downside of that? That you have to keep a compose file in addition to Kubernetes files? Like, I don't see that as a big deal. All my customers do it. They all fine with it. And the nice thing is that developers have a lot of opinions around how they develop, right? You take 5 developers, put them in a team, all 5 of them are going to use different workflows and tools to do their work. So Compose allows for that inherently out of the box without any advanced stuff or other services running or other tools running in the background. It just talks to Docker, tells it what to do. It's nice and short one-line commands. So I tend to love it. But I understand that not everyone wants to use Docker or even have it running locally at all. So totally fine. All right, I said I was going to wrap this up, and I think I mean it this time. Let's see. There's a meme around Node.js. The heaviest thing on earth is Node modules folder. Yeah, absolutely. There was a great little video I think I put on Twitter recently that was making fun of a Node.js. I mean, Node.js is one of my. I've spent more time in Node.js than almost every other language, right? So I love it and hate it. I'm learning more over time to more or less hate it, but I don't hate it because it can't get the job done or because it's not fast. It's all of the setup. It's the process. It's the huge, Node modules folders. It's the complexity of trying to use it on a developer machine while developing in a container. It's so much more inherently complex to do that than it is to use something like Golang. So. Oh, Conrad agrees with me on the stateful thing. I mean, I don't know what. I don't tell people that a lot of times because who cares, right? Everybody has their own preferences, but that's what people want to often ask me. They want to ask me about future of languages. Teams come in and they want to adopt Docker, and at the same time they're rethinking, we need to learn DevOps, we need to learn containers. Well, we probably should change our languages too, which is insane, right? Like you should not do all those things at the same time. But if you are curious and thinking about the future of your company, what I do see, almost everyone I work with that gets into containers, eventually they start experimenting with Go. And then they start to love Go. And then they find out that their Docker files can be a fraction of the size. And they find out that their deployments become easier and that the development environments, that they don't even need to run in containers because Go is easy enough locally to develop. And then the only thing they run in containers is just the back-end stuff they might be needing for development. So why not do that? That's also something I suggest in my Node.js course, is that it might just be easier to develop natively on your host machine, and then everything that you need, like the database, the back end, whatever you need, those run in containers, and you just point your local development environment to that, and you don't develop in a container. That's one option. If you're really, really into containers and you really get into it and you're like, I don't want even to have Node on my machine, I just want to do it all in a container, that's totally fine too. And I have done that as well. And sometimes I still do that. But you don't have to do that. This is not a prescription. You don't have to do it that way. So, all right. You all are great. But it's been 2 hours, and it's been an awesome time, and I am going to call it at this. So thank you all. I'm going to see you next week. We're going to have Pulumi on talking about GitOps infrastructure as real code, and we're going to have raw code on to do that. So please join us next Thursday and learn some more stuff about Pulumi. Ciao.